G'day spots, my name is John, and in this video you are going to learn how to host an Umbraco v9 powered website inside of a Docker container. Now specifically in this video you're going to learn how to configure SQL Server so your container and your host environment can talk together in perfect harmony. We're going to talk about permissions. I'm going to go through how you can create the Docker file and all the different steps and commands you need to know. Now we're also going to talk about mounts and volumes. So how you can actually do work inside your container without losing, say, all the media gets uploaded in the backend. And finally, and probably most importantly, I'm going to tell you why you actually want to do this. Now, when it comes to ASP.NET 5 CMS development, I use containers now and I've mugged off IIS. So I'll go through why I've done that and why you should consider doing this yourself. So if this all sounds bonza to you, then I recommend that you smash the subscribe button right now. Now, if you haven't come across my videos, my name is John, as I said at the beginning, silly, and I do weekly YouTube videos on CMS and Umbraco. Basically, videos will help you to become the best developer you can be. So if you want to learn more about development, then it costs you nothing. Don't be a numpty, be a legend, hit subscribe now. So assuming you've done that, let's quickly talk about why we should be hosting our website inside of Docker in the first place. When it comes to ASP.NET 5 development and Umbraco v9, I recommend that you always set up a Docker container to work locally. Now, the reason for this is because things have changed and the publishing process is very different in ASP.NET 5. So let me explain how it used to work, what the issues are with the new way, and then why a Docker container can help solve those problems. So as you can see on the screen in front of us, I've created this very beautiful diagram. I should be a designer. Now, historically in ASP.NET Framework and in Umbraco v8 and below, what would happen is as a developer, you'd set up your web root, you'd do all your custom development changes in here. Now, if you wanted to upload images into the CMS, add content, create document types, use model builder, the most efficient way of working was to create a website within the IIS web server, point that to your web root, and then off you could go. You'd have a persistent way of always accessing the CMS, and you'd also have a way to do local development against it. So this is kind of perfect. Now let's compare to how life works now in ASP.NET 5. So in ASP.NET 5, what happens is you create a web root, and because of the way that the publishing works within .NET Core, ASP.NET 5, 6, whatever you want to say, is that whenever you want to get the output and all the files for your website, you have to do a .NET publish. So this means that you can do all your code changes in the web root. You can use the local .NET Kestrel server to do your debugging. However, you don't have this persistent way of accessing the CMS anymore. And we kind of still need that to be efficient locally. So the problem with IIS nowadays is that every single time you want to create this persistent website, basically every single time you make a change, you're going to have to do a publish. So this is one, obviously, extra step that we didn't have to do before. Now, the other issue with this process is that whenever you're using this new website, if you're adding content, say like uploading media, if you're using the model builder, if you're using Usync, or even if you're generating the log files, what will happen is all these images and all this data and all these files will be created within the website project and not within your web root. And obviously, while we're doing local development, we'll actually probably want all of this thing to be checked into our source control. So basically, ASP.NET 5, there's some good things. Obviously, being able to host your website on multiple environments is great. However, in terms of local development, it's actually adding two really unuseful steps. And this is where a Docker container can help you. So using a Docker container, what we can do is create a Docker container, and then we can create mounts. So within our container, we can create mounts which point back to our web root. So this means that we'll have a persistent way to always access our website. And whenever anyone does, any image upload, model builder generation, Usync or logs, we can actually set that to get updated into our web root. And this way we've got an easy way to add these files in source control. So we have this nice persistent way. So using a Docker container is going to allow you to constantly access the CMS and work in a much nicer workflow compared to IIS. So nowadays, I don't really bother with IIS anymore when it comes to ASP.NET 5 and CMS development. If you want to do that, Up to you, however, this way is going to make you a lot more efficient and a lot more quicker. As usual, I'll start with the useful resources. Now, because there's going to be quite a lot of steps and this is quite fiddly, instead of trying to tippy-tappy something off screen, you have a few options. One, there is a tutorial that I've written, which is linked below. It's called Learn How to Host an Umbraco 9 Site Using Docker. All the steps, all the commands are there. Now, if you actually just want to get access to the end Docker file, go over to my GitHub, which is a John D. Jones at the GitHubs. If you want to be a legend and you could be follower number 100, follow me, star this repo, but on the homepage you can see that we've got this John Jones Umbraco.v9 starter kit. So clone away, copy away, make your life as happy as you are. Now for this tutorial I'm going to be doing everything on the Windows, so in order to get started with Docker, all you really need to do is just download Docker, and you want to get the Docker desktop. This is going to give you everything that you need. Now, the first thing that we're going to consider is what we need to get up and running within the container. So one of the main important things is the connection strings. So when we're developing, say, an IIS, we can just use, localhost or SQL Express or whatever we want. However, when we're working within a Docker container, localhost will be relevant to the container. So what we need to do is basically establish a connection from your machine into the container so we can create a connection. Now, out of the box, as you'd expect, it's Microsoft, everything is locked down and you cannot do this. Boo. So we need to do some configurations in order to make this all work. So the first thing we need to do is access this tool, which is called the Sql Manager. So you can find this tool. It's not the easiest thing to find. However, if you go into Windows and then syswow 64, because it is wow, scroll down. I should have probably done this beforehand, but there's a tool in here which is called Sql. There we go, Sql Manager 15 Musk. So SQL Server Manager 15 Musk, and this is the tool that you'll need to open. So fire up SQL Server Musk, and what you'll see here is this little jobbing. Now I've configured my system to work. However, what you want to do is go here, go to SQL Server Network Connection, find your SQL Server instance from the list. So mine is called SQL Express. From here, you've got some options. So the first thing you want to do is on this TCP thing, yours will say disabled if it's not by default. So what you want to do is double click on it and make sure this is set to yes. You also want to make sure that this listen all, because it's going to listen to everything, is working. Now, next thing you want to do is double click on this, and then as you can see here, we've got IP addresses. So when we're setting up our connection string, the easiest way I found to test this is to actually get your internal IP address, get the port number that your SQL instance is listening on, and then manually check that it's all working before you try and do it within a Docker container. Because if I'm honest, setting up Docker containers can be a bit fiddly, so you want to make yourself and your life as easy as possible. So I know this is really tiny on screen, but there's not much I can do. So click on this IP addresses, and then from here you should see this thing which is called TCP port. Have a look if any of those are set. However, if not, what you'll notice is there's this thing called TCP dynamic ports right down the bottom. But yeah, from here you can basically get access to your IP address and port number. Now, I said that a bit wrong, just your port number. Now, as soon as you actually start making any of these updates, what you'll need to do is reset your SQL Server. So again, you can do that from here. Go into your SQL Server services, that's a mouthful to say. Find your SQL instance, and then from here, right click on it, and then just do restart or stop start, whatever makes you happy. Now, the next thing we can do, let's just open up a new terminal, is get our internal IP address. So we can do that by typing in ipconfig. If I do the zooming in so you can see it. With your IP, the one that you'll need to find internally is this 1921. So it will be under the IPv4 addresses. You might see a few, like I've got one here, but yeah, just find the one which has got 192. So as you can see right here, I've got my IP address, I know my port number. So now if I fire up my SQL Server Manager, SSMS, we can test that the connection is working. And again, if you can't get it working in SQL Server Management Studio, then it's not going to work in your Docker container. So this is quite an important first step. So hopefully this will fire up and it won't take too long. There we go. So squizzle this over here. So to simply test it's working, let's go to connect. From here I can put in my internal IP and my port number. I think my password is this, or is it this? There you go. So yeah, you want to so when you're doing that, I should probably have reset that. Don't want to use Windows connection. You want to actually connect using your username and password in SQL. So use the SQL Server authentication and use the login and password defined within your Webby config. But as you can see, I've now connected to my database. So I know that my connection string is working. I know my internal port number, and for me it's 63636. I think the default one is 1433. However, going through that process and making sure you can connect here is super important. Otherwise, you're going to waste hours and hours of head scratching time. Now, we know how to get our IP address. The next thing I'm going to quickly cover is permissions. Now, in order to make this really useful for development, what we want to do is create a mount from our container file system to our solution. So as you can see here, I've got this thing called code. My starter kit is in this John D. Jones Umbraco V9 starter kit. So in here, I want to start doing some mappings. Now, out of the box, this probably isn't the most recommended way of hosting a Docker container and setting up the files. In production, you'll probably want to use something like a volume, or if you really want to be great at Umbraco, instead of using the file system provider, which is the default one, maybe you want to set up Umbraco to work with an Azure blob storage or an AWS S3 bucket. And this way you won't have some of these problems. However, for development, mount is good enough and it's going to do what we need. Now the key with mount is that you need to make sure that you have the right folder permissions and file permissions. And if you don't have this, basically when you try and run the Docker commands, things will just time out. It's very likely you won't get an error message, which can be very annoying. So to run you through the process, right click on any of your projects. So I would do this on the solution level, but here I'm doing it on a project level. So I always make sure that read only is not ticked. Click apply. Yeah, whatever. Then we want to go to the security tab at the top. Now, because this is development, you know the drill if you see my videos for a while. Let's crack on the everybody account, and with everyone, make sure that we've got modifier. So all you need to do is click on add, type in everyone, and off you go. Now, I think from this list, if you type in advanced and search for Docker, you'll see that there's a Docker's user group. So if you want to have more control and do things properly, you probably just want to put the right permissions on here. However, for ease of use, everyone for the win. Now, basically any single one of these mounts that you want to create in Docker, you need to make sure you have these permissions. So let's talk about what some of these folders might be. So one of them for me is going to be my Umbraco models folder. So this is the folder that when I'm using the Umbraco model builder, that files get generated in. So this needs to be a mount. Now, in my website project specifically, let's zoom in a bit. What do we need to think about? So I want to share my Usync folder. So whenever I do any Usync updates within my container, I want them persisted into my solution folder. Now, we've also got this Umbraco folder. So Umbraco is basically like a temp folder. There's loads of stuff in there. So first, we've got the data folder. So in the data folder, we have our temp folder. So look, we've got stuff like the new cache, the examiner indexes. Now this doesn't necessarily need to be a file mount. I don't really care if I persist this data and it's in my source control. However, we can use something called a Docker volume. And Docker volume means that when you kill and close your container, all this data won't get lost. So for me, you can put basically your temp packages in a volume. We've also got our log files. So our log files can also be a volume. Again, I don't want to check these into source control. The other ones you need to think about are the www root. So in www root, first we've got the Umbraco folder. So in in the media folder, not the Umbraco folder, silly Billy. So in the media folder, whenever you go into the CMS and upload any content, it's going to be added into this folder. So we want this folder to be a mount. Now, another interesting thing that you can do in the back end is actually you can go in there and you can start messing about with scripts and views, and you can actually start doing some of the UI presentation development inside of Umbraco backend. So without creating mounts, all these changes are going to get lost. So what you need to do is also create a mount on the views folder, and you'll also probably want to create a mount on the CSS folder and the scripts folder. So basically, let's just be honest, it'll be much easier just to have a mount on the www root folder. So this is what I suggest you do: share a mount on www root and views and Usync, and then in Umbraco we're going to use a volume because we don't really want to persist it in source control. However, once you're setting this up yourself, you might want to tweak it, but that's roughly the process. So now we have our SQL connection defined. We've also got our file permissions. Now let's quickly look at how I'm going to configure this. So as you can see right here, I've got this thing called appsettings.docker.json. And if I fire up my development environment within Visual Studios, you can see that all I've got here is my connection string. So I've got my server IP, my port number that we discussed. So this change is going to be applied after my app settings. Now, when you're doing this, if you're new to .NET Core, how your app settings get applied is done within program.cs. So looking at mine very quickly, because this confused me when I first started looking at Umbraco v9. So in mine, I've got this configuration where by default, the app settings have to exist and they always have to be imported. And this is determined by these two extra parameters. So you can see that we've got the builder.addJSON file, and then I'm saying that it has to be mandatory. Now, after this has been loaded, I'm then getting the environment variable name, which is @net core environment. Then I'm trying to load in and apply any other changes on top of my app settings. So if you're trying to work with Docker containers and you're setting your ASP.NET Core environment variable and it's not working, think about coming into program CS and update these files. And that's pretty much all the prerequisites you need to do. So connection string, making sure that your app settings load correctly, and then making sure that those folders that we discussed have the correct file permissions. Now the next step in our journey is to look at creating this Docker file. We are now at the exciting part, creating this Docker container that's going to host everything. So in your solution, you want to create a Docker file. Basically, it's just called Docker file with a capital D, no file extension, and we'll be putting all of our commands in there. Now, this is my Docker file, and let's break down how it's split up. So the first thing you need to do is set a base type. So we want to basically create a base type which works with ASP.NET 5, so we can use this Microsoft.com.NET SDK 5. We also then want to set the working directory. So workdir/source. Now, looking back at my folder structure here, you can see that my solution is generated into 3 parts. So I have my web root project, I've added all my custom code inside of this john.jones.core library, and then I'm also using the Umbraco model builder, and I'm doing it in the code first deployment model. So every single time models are generated, they're actually copied into here as CS files. So this means that when I'm setting up my Docker file, I need to get all that stuff, make sure it's all working, and then copy it into my container. So we can do that using basically the copy and run, and the first sort of like 10 lines or 9 lines, they're pretty much repeated. So we're remembering to put in the folder name, we're pointing it to the project file, we're using a .NET restore, so all the NuGet packages will be taken care of for us. Then we're doing exactly the same for the models project and the website project. Now, once all of those have compiled and gone through, you can use the copy space dot space dots. So this is then going to take all of that output and it's going to copy it into the container. And then we can do a .NET publish, and then we can actually point that at our web root. We want to set it as our release rather than a development build. So this is the target. And then we've also got the output folder. So in this instance, we're going to output everything into app/out. Now, the second part is a bit of a continuation, and this is the instruction of how the site will be hosted. So again, we just say here from Microsoft, we're using this as our base template. This time we're going to set our working directory to the app folder, which we've just copied our files to. We're going to expose port 80. So again, when we're hosting things in a Docker container, what will happen is that port 80 on your hosting machine needs to get mapped to port 80 in your Docker container. So you need that 8080 mapping in order for everything to work. So this is part of that process. If you don't remember to expose that port, it's going to be blocked and locked and you're going to have a load of issues. So in here, I'm going to set my ASP.NET Core environment to Docker. So as you saw previously, I've created that separate environment variable, or the app settings, which has got the Docker release target on it. I'm setting my ASP.NET Core URLs to include port 80, so things go right. And then after I've done all of that, I'm basically going to copy the output of my publish, and then I'm going to put it into the output directory. And then finally, I'm going to define the entry point. So that's going to be the .NET command, and we're going to open up this John.Jones Umbraco 9 sample.dll. So as you can see, it might look a little bit confusing if you're not new to Docker. However, the process is fairly simple. Is define a base type, define all the files, make sure you have all the dependencies, copy it into the container, and then once it's in the container, you want to do a publish, and then you want to set everything up so we can talk to it. Let's have a look at how I created that Docker instance. Now, the first thing we need to do to create a container from an image is use the old classic Docker run. Classic. Now, the first command I'm passing into my long ass instruction is -d. This basically means run this command as a background process and don't hog up the terminal. So if you don't do this, basically when you do Docker run, it's going to lock the terminal up, and when you're debugging, it's a pain in the bottom because you have to keep opening the terminal. So I recommend you always put that. Now, the next thing we're going to add in is the port command, and this is going to map the port from my host machine to the port in the container. So what this basically looks like is that if I go to localhost normally, it's going to go to IIS. I don't want that to happen, so I want to access my container through port 8080. Obviously, you can use any port you want. However, yeah, this is just something to be aware of. You're probably going to have to create different ports for each of your websites that you want to host. Now, underneath this, we get some interesting bits, and this is where we're looking at mounts and volumes. So basically, in the mount section, we can use --mount, bind type source, PWD means current directory. So this is going to get to my root solution directory. And this is really important for mapping anything which happens within the container that I want to basically check into source control. So any files that I'm expecting to add to Git, I would put as a mount within your development Docker container setup. So for me, I want to add everything in the www root. So in here, this is going to be all the media. And if you're new to the Umbraco CMSs a bit and you're unaware, if you go into the backend, you can do things like start messing around with style sheets directly in the CMS. So this is the reason why you want to do all of www root. You can even update templates and CMSs up, templates and HTML within this section. So yeah, you want to add in all of that folder, because if you don't do that, that capability will not work. Let's be honest, that might not be a bad thing. Now I also want to include the Usync folder. So when I'm in the backend, whenever I go to synchronization, Usync, whenever I click one of these buttons on this third-party package, all this data is going to be added and I can add it into source control. And yes, I did say backend and I didn't make a joke about it. Finally, we've also got the Umbraco model builder. So again, when I'm in the backend, I got it that time, and you go to settings and you go to Model Builder. When you click this button here, this is basically going to get added into my host directory, so I can again add these files into source control. And then I'm also going to add in the views, because as you saw, we can update the views and the templates within the backend. Now after this, I'm adding in two different types of volumes. So I've got the log volume. So this is basically going to point to my Umbraco logs folder. So this means that whenever I'm doing a container and it's running, if I decided, I don't like this container anymore, and I delete it, see a container. If I go to volumes, I'm still going to have all the data within my log volume and my temp volume. And then all I need to do is fire up a new instance. What we'll see here is that I've now got a new container, still got the same volume. Now, you don't really need to store your temp volume data or the temp data. However, stuff in here includes things like the examine index and the front end cache. So if you're deleting and creating a lot of containers, because that's the way that you roll, then yeah, adding this kind of stuff into a volume, it's basically just going to mean things are going to speed up when you're deleting your containers a lot. And yeah, it's always a good idea to keep hold of your logs. However, both of these things you do not want to add into the source control, so volume rather than mount. Makes sense, beautiful, glad we got there. Now the next thing we want to do is basically give your container a name. If you don't do this, Docker's basically going to give you one of those crazy names like Magical Unicorn or Brick and Idiots, or you know what it is. So in here you can see that I'm using the nice name Umbraco. That's basically what that -- name is all about. Then after that, I'm going to give it the image name. Remember, we called it the Umbraco 9 starter kit in the previous command. And then finally, I'm going to pass in my env ASP.NET Core environment, and I'm going to set that to Docker. That just means it's going to use the app settings.docker.json. So all of those things combined basically means that we're going to have this nice image that we can access. Now I've got a nice container. All of my updates going to easily be added in source control, and life is peachy. Before we do the wrapping of the ups, I want to give you one last debugging tips before we go on our merry little ways. And this is around debugging. Now, when you're setting up containers, a lot of the time it's trial and error. So you create a Dockerfile instance, you start doing the Docker build commands, and you try things until it basically works. Now, one of the most frequent issues that I bump into is getting paths wrong or getting my mount wrong, and that's because I simply don't understand what I've copied into the container. However, if you use the docker copy command, so as you can see here, it's docker space cp, give it your image name, so mine's called Umbraco, and then a colon, and then we're just going to give it slash for the root of my container, and then we're going to give it a location on my computer. So I'm going to give this cp Umbraco app. Once this fires off, what we can do is go to my hard drive. From here, I'm going to go to my Umbraco 9. No, I'm not. I'm going to go to my C drive, and you can see here that I've got this folder called app. And basically, the content of my container is now being copied in here. So I can have a complete look at what's been configured. I can see what's in my application. I can go through all my configuration files, make sure all my transforms are working. So this can be really useful when you're trying to debug stuff. So don't forget about it. Boom! There you have it. You should now hopefully be an absolute development optimized container mofo. Now, I really do recommend that you go through this process and start using containers in anger. When you go from V8 to V9, it is very annoying not being able to just have an IIS website point at your web root. And for my experimenting and for my testing, working with Docker containers is the most efficient way to build stuff with Umbraco, so I highly recommend you do it. Now, I know the video banged on a little bit, so thanks very much for watching. It may seem a little overwhelming. However, once you go through this process once or twice, super simple, I'm sure you will have it nailed like an absolute boss. So if you've liked this video and you're still watching, kudos to you because it's a bit of a long one. First, obviously, hit the like button. Let me know you want me to do more YouTube Umbraco videos. I very much appreciate it. Also helps my video get shown to more people. So again, make yourself a legend. And as I'm saying now, if you didn't like it, hit like anyway and force someone to watch a video that you weren't keen on. Ha. Otherwise, hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more in this series. This is about episode 15 now. There's going to be a load more, so if you want to learn more about Umbraco, CMS development, blah blah blah, I've said it before at the beginning of the video, smash subscribe to be a legend. The other things I can say, I do have an Umbraco v9 book that you could go on the waiting list. Link is below. I'll say more about that at a later date. I also do a Sunday newsletter with just industry news, all that sort of stuff that makes me excited. So yeah, you can subscribe for free. Again, link is below. Anyway, I hope you now know how to containerize like a mofo. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world out there, and happy coding.